Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Special thanks for coming up. I'm really excited about today and today's event. I'm not going to take very long. I'm really up here just to introduce Doug Coleman, but a couple things I want to hit really first. So, first event of our speaker series for 2020. Before I get into anything else, I just want to point to Nancy Tynes. Would you stand up, Nancy, please? So Nancy organizes all this stuff, and everybody in this room appreciates what you're doing. Somebody said it was kind of like herding cats, wild cats, and I think she's trying to actually pull their teeth out at the same time. So it's a lot of hustle, so thank you, Nancy. It's great to see this finally get launched and so forth. So a little bit about the series. It's going to be monthly. That's our plan for this next year. And we're going to focus kind of in some general categories, and so I'll share those with you. But not to be just inclusive to these, there's probably more, and we're open for recommendations for speakers as well. So, not to mention our rich history. Today is going to be our history, and this is going to be a lot of fun. Outdoor adventure, of course, you all know is close to my heart. Community, education, and the environment. Not so sure we're going to cross the political lines, but you never know. So if you have ideas, please share them. Get them to myself or Nancy, and we'll get them in the pipeline and vet things out as we can. The other thing, a part of this speaker series, to be completely transparent, was we're really trying to stimulate some more activity up here at a lot of different levels. And so we're trying to schedule these in a way that you can go get a run in this morning, you can go skiing, you can play some golf, you can go for a walk, you can go hunt for your dog or whatever it is, work in the garden, but get outdoors and get some fresh air and exercise. And come up here and there'll be a piece of culture with the speaker series going on. Also enjoy some of our hospitality, whether it's up at the grill, the copper mine, or just go grab a beer at the edge. So we're really just trying to kind of reinvigorate a lot of the things that we appreciate up here. So the other thing, I guess, before I move on, I just want to talk about transportation. I know some of you come up from the valley, and so we're experimenting with shuttles coming out of the valley. And if for any other reason, please keep an eye on that schedule. For any other reason, at least lessens our footprint on the environment. So it's for all the right reasons. So lastly, I just want to say, how excited I am about today. I really like these things because to hear the people that brought Wintergreen out of the ground and the opportunity, the vision that they created, the willfulness that they had to get through all the challenges to finally get to the opportunity to make it happen, and then here we are today to get up every day and enjoy it. So it's pretty special. And Doug Coleman is the executive director of the Wintergreen Nature Foundation, and he's going to be the MC today. So he's going to keep things moving, and I hope it's inclusive of all of us. Everybody engage and ask questions and what have you. There's a whole network of support people here that were involved besides our speakers. The one thing that attracted me here, only being here a little over 2 years now, was the sensitivity to the environment. And Doug and I got to meet early on, and I found there was a whole lot of alignment. The way he was thinking, I was thinking, his actions and my actions relative to preserving and saving the environment overall. And hopefully it's close to everybody's heart that's here. With that said, Doug has some credential here that I think really is worth noting, and some of you are well aware of it, but I want to say it again. So in 1987, Wintergreen received, with the help of another network person here that we're going to talk to a little bit later, Mark Glickman, they received the National Environmental Quality Achievement Award. And that was a long time ago. That was before it was cool to get an environmental award. And so that speaks to, again, what we have here to cherish and enjoy every day. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Doug. You have no boundaries here, Doug, except for the 3 minutes that we promised you. Let's enjoy. Thanks, Doug.
A very dangerous thing to tell me, but can everybody hear me? Can you hear well? I'm not sure how I got the dubious pleasure of doing this, except that I was one of the 3 people in that geeky photo that they sent out that was in San Francisco with that award. So I will accept the responsibility of doing that. Wintergreen is a legacy piece, and the uniqueness of this place continues to be nationally ranked. I believe that we could get another national award next week if we applied. A lot of it is because of the things that we're doing. And we all build on something that someone else did. And we are all the beneficiaries of work that was done years ago, from Don Faulkner to LF and others. You know, Faulkner dreamed it, and LF's crew had to bring it to reality. And so it's a legacy piece there. And Wintergreen is incredibly unique for any number of reasons. And if I leave anyone out or leave anything out, it is in this book. How many of you have this book? A lot of people do. Okay, if you don't have it, you should have it. And don't just look at the pictures, read it. Start with the acknowledgments, and that will set the stage for you to understand. And if there's something that Tony or LF or I don't cover today, it's going to be in the book. And the portion that LF is covering, will be covering, and Tony will be covering, are about chapters 5 through into 12. And it's a period between 1973, 1987, 88, 89, something like that. But we're also joined by a number of other people that were, I don't want to call them like George Nicholas did, quirky geniuses, but all of you are geniuses in one way or the other. I won't call you quirky. But there were some incredible support people, unique, that made all of this happen. And Wintergreen is unique. Part of it was unique before any of us got here, and some of it we're not responsible for. What we were given was a mountain range that's only 1 ridge wide, and you have an ecological corridor that narrows down and becomes very significant here. You've got, for example, where we're sitting. I don't know what Wintergreen paid to site the Mountain Inn Village right here, but I got news for you. Our research has shown that man has been here for 25,000 years. There are approximately 100 Native American sites within a quarter of a mile of where we're sitting. So they chose the site long before. The uniqueness is also has to do with ecosystems that are here. And I remember in the early days walking with LF, and the footprint was already on, but we were finding things that were unique. And those walks with him resulted in the formation of the nature preserve at Shamokin Springs, Allen Creek in the valley, and the rich history of the valley. The valley has a cultural history that leaves the mountain in the dust, but the natural history on the mountain is probably greater than the valley because it's least disturbed. But the Trillium Field is another example. Trillium Field was slated for development where all the trillium blooms. It was going to be a hotel site. And LF and I looked at it one day, and we walked in, we looked at it, and we said, how do we get this out of development? How do we back up? Backing up is not easy, but Wintergreen did it. And the recognition of this is extremely important. LF listened, and he heard it, and he believed in science. And we all knew in 1973, 74 that this was a unique place environmentally. We knew it was probable before we even looked at things. And over the years that have passed, I can now tell you that it is provable. When you look at the work that the Smithsonian scientists have done, we're working on 3 programs now that probably will have national or international significance research-wise. And we've sort of been providing the data and the research that confirms what we sort of believed in the first place. And knowing that gives us all a certain responsibility, but it also, I think, is the key to promoting Wintergreen for what it really is. Wintergreen's uniqueness is what Nancy can promote and Rob can promote as very special based on all of this, some of the work that we did, some of the work that we knew in the early days. From the standpoint of real estate, the uniqueness is what you sell. From the standpoint of protecting, I'm looking at Jay Roberts here. Jay and I sort of look in the mirror about protecting all the open space, which was covenanted, and the original promise kept for over half of Wintergreen to stay open. And if you look at you, at all of you, when you share, you understand, know, and share the uniqueness of this place, you're part of the legacy too. And I can tell you this, there's one thing I am 100% sure of, and that is that when you promote, sell, protect, share the legacy of this place, you are not presenting the sizzle. You are presenting the steak because it is real. What you have here is real. It is documented by the work we're doing as real. It is documented culturally. It is documented scientifically. It is documented in every single case. So with the uniqueness that we have, and this is directed at you, Bob, and Jay, and me, we all have a responsibility to understand that legacy and to take care of it going forward. And as I introduce LF, who's been a good friend over the years, and Tony, I don't want to go into the fact that LF was educated VMI, Darden School, congressman, developer of Wintergreen, I guess candidate for lieutenant governor at one point, and Tony's with him, and Tony's law degree made him Attorney General under Governor Mills Godwin. A lot of high quality background there. But I want to read this chapter, this part of the book, in the acknowledgments where we thanked LF. And this will serve as my introduction to him. There were many times in the early development days when the failure of Wintergreen seemed imminent, and most eastern resorts faced or underwent bankruptcy one or more times. Wintergreen survived those trying times during early oil embargoes, high interest rates, cost overruns, second home tax issues, and related recessions. During this time, LF Payne's unique leadership efforts were a major factor in Wintergreen's survival. Would you welcome LF Payne?
So first, I want to say thanks very much, Doug, for such a kind introduction. Rod, thank you very much for introducing us. And Tony, my good friend, I'm glad to share the stage with you because I can't think of anybody who, when the chips were down, who did any more for Wintergreen than Tony did. I'd also like to acknowledge a lot of my colleagues from the days when Wintergreen was starting that are here with us today. Peter Farley is here, Gunter, Mark, Tim, Dan, Gary, Cabell, Dudley, all people who did things that really made this place work. And had they not have been around, it probably wouldn't have. And so I'm going to ask, as a point of personal privilege, if all of you would stand up before we start, and I'd like these people to be recognized. So I've always thought Wintergreen is just an incredible story, and it's really very rich, and it's really a journey, I think, that not only those of us who just stood up and Tony and me were part of, but really all of you have been part of that as well. And it started back in the 60s, and we've heard stories, especially if you read this book, about the visioning of a blind man in Richmond and Don Faulkner and how they envisioned that a place like this might exist. And put all this land together, 13,000 acres very quietly in the early days. And all of that, I think, was so significant. But I think that journey continues up to today, and there are chapters being written. I mean, Rod's writing a chapter as we sit here about what do you do when you have a ski season and no snow at Christmas time, and what's that going to look like as Wintergreen goes forward. So they're just, I mean, chapters of Wintergreen have been written from the early 60s right up to today. We're going to talk mostly about that chapter in terms of maybe the implementation of it and a bit about experimentation. And experimentation we'll get into was Wintergreen Partners, something nobody had ever done before, and how might that work for us. And as we think about Wintergreen, I think for all of us, this was never just a job, or it was never just a project, or a place even. I mean, this was a mission. And it was a mission with real purpose. And our purpose, as I've reflected on this after the fact, I mean, we learned and appreciated so much Wintergreen and all that it had to offer, and we were really working very hard to try to make it accessible to many people who would never enjoy it unless we figured out a way to be able to build the roads and create the housing and to, the restaurants and skiing and all those things that were done. And as a result of this, so many people have come to Wintergreen, and it's affected so many lives over time, and that's obviously very gratifying to all of us who were here early on to start making this happen. Other purposes was that it was a place where people could come and help build the dream, if you will, and work with each other and learn and add value. And there's so many people who have actually worked here over the years and have made a contribution and have gone on and done so many other things. I continue to see people in so many walks of life. And so that was part of its purpose, if you will, to create that crucible and allow lots of people then to go on to do lots of different things. And it's served as that for me personally. It so happened that we are in Nelson County, and when we started this community in the early 70s, I mean, Nelson County was one of the 10 poorest counties in Virginia out of roughly 100 counties. I mean, it's a county that had lost all of its private sector employment. There used to be a big American cyanamide plant in Piney River, and that closed, and there was a plant stone plant that was in Schuyler, Virginia, and that had closed, and so there were really no jobs here. And generally speaking, I mean, if you wanted a job, if you lived in Nelson County and wanted a job, you needed to drive a school bus, or you needed to teach school, or there were some public sector jobs, and that was kind of it. So there was a challenge here, and just very quickly in terms of how's that worked out, when we came here, that 13,000 acres was paying less than $10,000 a year in taxes to Nelson County. Today, that same land is paying well over half of all the taxes in this county, and as a result, this county is no longer one of the 10 lowest, but it has moved way up, and we see all new schools, and everybody in this county has really benefited from Wintergreen and what we collectively have been able to do. And I think, as Doug has pointed out, but it was a matter of doing this, not just accomplishing these objectives, but doing it in a way where we could be good stewards both of the land, which is the title of this book, and I do recommend you read it. It is interesting. And secondly, good stewards of people, and we recognized if we were going to succeed, we had lots of stakeholders. I mean, we not only had our employees and our owners and our bankers and others who we had to, as a business, to be loyal to and provide good stewardship. But we had our property owners, many of whom took great risks to come here and invested substantial amounts of money. We had our resort guests who came here, and we had people who stood up for us in the county, the public servants and others. We had a lot of people engaged. So it was not just about stewardship of the land, which we take a lot of pride in, as Doug has pointed out, but it was also trying to be good stewards for all of these groups of people who are the stakeholders in Wintergreen. And I think there are lots of anecdotal examples of really good outcomes there too, and that continues to be the case even to this day. There are really kind of 4 phases, I would say, of Wintergreen. One was this visionary phase of the Richmond folks who put the land together and who had the vision about what this might be, but then they weren't quite sure how to get it done. And then there was the implementation stage, which, as Doug said, was kind of a 1973 beginning phenomenon, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about that in a minute. But then we went on to go through a lot of implementation, and then in 1984 was kind of the experimentation phase, and Tony and I will talk about that because that's what we did together quite a bit at that time in terms of creating a whole new way of owning something like this, not knowing that it was going to work or not. And then I would say maybe it's like continuing to build the dream and live the dream, and that's kind of what Wintergreen's about these days from my perspective, although others may have different perspectives about that. So let me just share a couple of stories as opposed to chronologically going through what went on. So the date is April 1, 1973. There's a Board of Supervisors meeting in Livingston, Nelson County. And the big deal is the master plan of Wintergreen, which nobody's ever seen, is coming before the board to be approved or not by the Board of Supervisors. It's a very big day. I'm now working, I'm still in graduate school, but I've accepted a job with Cabot & Forbes, which is a large Boston-based development company, very prestigious company, but never done anything like this, recreational real estate. And we're there with their architects and economic advisors and others, and it was a large gathering of people who were very interested in this. Nelson County in 1973, as I mentioned, didn't have a whole lot going on economically. It wasn't a particularly sophisticated county. And the board is listening to this presentation that's being given to them about all that could happen and 13,000 acres and 5,500 homes and what this could mean and all this. And at the end, Gary Green, who's my boss from Boston, who's there from Cabot & Forbes, does a great job of presenting and says, "Do you have any questions?" And the supervisors kind of look at each other, and the chairman was a guy named Oda Carter. Oda Carter was a small man, but he had a big booming voice, and looked around, and finally Mr. Carter was sitting down and looking up at Gary and said, "Mr. Green, I just got one question for you." He said, "What's that, Mr. Carter?" "Are you going to put a merry-go-round up there at Wintergreen on that mountain?" And he said, "My granddaughter just loves those merry-go-rounds." And Gary Green said, "Mr. Carter, if you want a merry-go-round on that mountain, we'll put a merry-go-round there." And I've thought about it since. I think we kept every single promise we've ever made to Nelson County, except we've never put that merry-go-round on the mountain for Mr. Carter. But with that, the project was approved, unanimous approval, and we're off, and now we're beginning to build. So I'm now out of school, we start building the road up the mountain, and we've got so much to do. I mean, there are no roads and no water, no sewer, no telephone lines. We've got this big community to build, and it's like a blank canvas that you can start painting on. And my friends here were part of this as well. So we started basically at the gatehouse, and at that time, if you wanted to drive from where the gatehouse is to here, you had to plan to spend about 45 minutes doing it because it was a really treacherous, rough Jeep trail and scary to be able to do that. And if it had rained, forget it. There's no way you got from there to here. So that's kind of what we started with. And we then laid out this road that's now Wintergreen Drive, realizing we wanted it to be comfortable, and so it couldn't be over 10% grade, and we designed it that way. And then we started building it, and one of the things that we did, and this was very early on to let everybody, including the people who were going to be building here, know that we were very serious about protecting the land. And these were people who had built other roads. In fact, they'd been at Massanutten and built their project as well before they came to us. And we said, we just want to let you know that we're dead serious about designing things and building things with nature. And we spent so much time, I mean, there'd be arguments about, well, we got to take this tree down. And we say, oh, no, you don't. And, time and time again, as we built the road, and even today, I was thinking about it as I was driving up, the slopes are very steep because we didn't want to cut any additional trees. We wanted to make this a road that accommodated traffic, but really felt more like you were driving through a forest than it was a big entrance situation. And so it took a very long period of time to do that. Simultaneously, we were beginning to clear slopes for the ski slopes, 80 acres of skiing. We had to clear all of those first, and then we were going to grade them, and then we were going to be able to plant grass and so forth. And again, very hard to get here. We'd built enough of a road that we could get trucks up at that time, and we had crews who had been doing work in forestry for a long time, and woodcutters, people who I'd known for years. I grew up next door in Amherst County and were able to call on people to come here and work on things like this. So we started this 80 acres at the bottom of Potato Patch. And we started that day, and we were going to do this clearing. We had a timeline laid out. All day long, we cleared 1/4 of an acre, which is not very much. But the most significant thing was that we killed 4 rattlesnakes in that first 1/4 of an acre. And we were thinking, oh my gosh, that means there are 16 rattlesnakes an acre, and there are 80 acres. That's like 1,200 rattlesnakes that we're going to have to deal with just trying to do this. And it was a serious matter, though, because the people who were there didn't come back. They weren't risking their lives to clear these ski slopes. And so we had to do research. We had to find out what people wore in the Mississippi and places like that as they were dealing in places where snake bites were serious. We got anti-venom serum, and we did lots of things to be able then to make sure that we got our crew back. But there were just so many, I mean, we could talk all day about the stories of things that happened that were like, oh my gosh, how do we get over this hurdle? And we were operating in an environment where most people were thinking this was a fool's errand. I mean, generally the feeling was there's no way that people are going to buy second homes in Nelson County. I mean, Nelson County didn't have 10 second homes in the entire county when we started this, so it wasn't like there was a huge market or demand. And we were doing foolish things like building ski slopes on the east side of the Blue Ridge Mountains where nobody would ever be able to, build and hold snow. And so we'd done a lot of research, and we were concerned about those things, but we tried to mitigate all that. But the whole process then was just one challenge after another. So they were the early days, and we were then under the ownership of Cabot and Forbes. They provided leadership from Boston. I was called the assistant project manager, and I was sort of a guy on site. And my boss, Gary Green, ultimately moved here. And he was a wonderful guy and couldn't have asked for a better person to do this. But long story short, by 1976, which was 3 or 4 years later, lots of things were going on in the environment. The biggest one was that due to oil shortages and things like that, the prime rate had gone to 21 or 22%. And our loans that we had were prime plus 3. So we were paying 25% interest, and clearly you can't do that. And so it became very clear to Cabot and Forbes, not just about Wintergreen, but every project they had across the country. And by this time, we had gotten the Sea Pines Plantation Company out of Hilton Head to come in, and they were part of us as well, doing marketing and doing a lot of the resort, running the resort except for skiing. And so both of the companies kind of hit the skids at that time. And so this was a big transition that occurred 1976. And what ended up happening is that the Bankers Trust Company out of New York that had a $10 million unsecured note to Cabot and Forbes. And this property had no liens on it, so Cabot and Forbes said, okay, we'll take care of Bankers Trust. You know, let us, don't make us pay back your note, and we'll give you Wintergreen. And so, like, in a very short period of time, we went from a company that was struggling with Cabot and Forbes to a whole new ownership situation where we had a big New York bank who had never owned anything in Virginia and didn't know anything about Wintergreen, suddenly was our owner. And so we had another transition that we wanted to go through, had to go through at that time. We then had, and that was one that was really proved to be interesting because they came not knowing anything and asked us to put together a one-year plan. And that plan was basically in 1976, 77, in that period, because what they wanted to do was to find somebody to buy it and so they wouldn't have, they had no interest in owning Wintergreen. Well, two things happened in that year. One, we had the greatest year ever, and so this 1976 plan, we greatly exceeded it in terms of the promise that they were looking at in terms of this property. And two, they fell in love with Wintergreen. They came, and more people from Bankers came. And during the course of time they were here, they held executive committee meetings here, and they were strategically trying to change themselves. And much of that happened here as they became one of the primary merchant banks in the U.S. But we played a little part in doing all of that. For 8 years then, we built Wintergreen with Bankers Trust, and there are tons of stories about Bankers Trust and what went on there. And they basically said to us, we're going to give you a lot of autonomy. We'll have our executive committee, but as long as you continue to give us these plans and meet them, and we're going to give you a lot of freedom, including using any of the assets that you've got to go leverage those and see if you can get people like Cabell, who's here, who was then with Central Fidelity Bank, to lend you money, so that we began to find other lenders who could come in and help us. And we then had a good period of time for 8 years with the Bankers Trust Company. So this brings us to when Tony and I first met, and
as adversaries.
As big adversaries. And those of you, many of you in this room know about this, but what happened to Bankers Trust is they were told they were a New York State bank, and the New York State Bank Regulatory Authority said to them, you're not supposed to own real estate. We've just noticed that you've had this place now for almost 8 years. You've got to divest, and you've got to do it by the latter part of 1984. And so we were in the beginning of 1984, and they then suddenly got interested in finding a buyer or buyers. And they began having people who came who were going to be the potential buyers. And I got to meet most of them and had a chance to show them around and learn a little bit about what their plans were. And the buyers who likely were going to buy Wintergreen had no interest in doing what we liked about Wintergreen. I mean, they saw this as, this was an opportunity to take something that had a great reputation and a great brand, and they could come in and trade on that brand and very quickly get that money back and make a lot of money, and then sell off pieces and leave. And so I saw this as this is the end of the Wintergreen dream as we know it, if this succeeds. And so I talked to others, and we talked about, well, why don't we collectively, the Wintergreen community, why don't we buy this ourselves? We love the place. It's our dream. We really ought to control this as we went forward. And so we said, okay, the way to do this is get our Property Owners Association, front and center. We'll let them be the entity that really, figures this out along with us, and that we will then be able to move forward. Well, long story short, Property Owners Association couldn't buy this. It really had to do with the fact that you couldn't make all the people in the property owners association come up with enough money to be able to put the deal together. And if some did and some didn't, and even if you figured it out, you'd have a terrible situation remaining. So we had to invent something, and now the clock's ticking, and they'd given us an option to do this, but we were having like maybe 5 months at this point, because we kicked this off on May 1st and we had to close by the end of July. So we were in the April period figuring out an entity that could buy Wintergreen, and figured out Wintergreen Partners, which was an entity that we said, okay, that's anybody who chooses to do it can be part of Wintergreen Partners, but you got to be a property owner and you've got to come up with $6,000, and we need 1,000 of our property owners to do it, and we can borrow $4 million, and that'll give us $10 million, and we'll take on the liability of Bankers Trust and then have the properties left to develop and put the deal together. Challenging though, because nobody had ever done anything like this, and we had to have the SEC look at it, we had to have the Internal Revenue Service and all these entities look at it, because to put it together only to have them take it apart would have been disastrous. So we were struggling doing this, had it put together, but it was a hard thing to sell, and Peter and Tim and Gary and all of our salespeople were working so hard on this with their property owners. But the feeling was, hey, wait a minute, you're asking us to buy something we already own. I mean, what is it that we're going to get if, in fact, we put $6,000 into this deal? And it was a great question, you know, and one that we were struggling trying to find ways to make sure that there was enough value, whether it be by using facilities, or we had something that would be part of your deed that made your property more valuable than the one that didn't, and we went through all those things. But long story short, property owners weren't buying what we had to sell, and it was a huge concern, because what I knew but I couldn't talk about is, if we can't put this together, we're going to have some bad people from, you know, Miami who are going to be here owning this place, and it's just not going to be the dream that we all want it to be, and it likely won't even exist maybe by this time. So we began then and rented auditorium, actually hotel ballrooms like this in Northern Virginia and in Tidewater and Richmond and here, and we got all of our property owners, and we'd have like 500 people who would show up and who just didn't understand what it was we were trying to do and how we were trying to sell it. And I remember being on stage in Northern Virginia in a big hotel, and several hundred people were there, and I had the microphone, I was explaining this, and one of our property owners, Mark Freed, who I think you know well and a good friend of mine now, wasn't then, said, "This is ridiculous." And he came up and tried to take the microphone out of my hand while I was standing on stage doing a PowerPoint like this. And I'm thinking, if I let this microphone go, this deal is done, and I'm not going to let it go. And so we were standing there really in front of all these people holding on to this microphone. And I finally said to Mark, I said, "Mark, if you want to talk to all these folks, you rent the ballroom and get us together, and you can have the stage, but right now this is my meeting." And so Mark sat down, and off we went. But the issue was that the partners, especially in Richmond where we had lots of them, organized and decided, just when we thought things couldn't get worse, they did. They organized and said, "We're going to stop this from happening." And that's where I turned this story over to Tony, because Tony was sort of the knight, in my judgment, who rode in on the white horse and saved the place. So, Tony.
So, as an aside, by the way, talking about the development, when you finally got to Wintergreen on Wintergreen Drive, on 664, you were on dirt road for a while. That was pretty hazardous before you could even get into the entrance here at Wintergreen. So eventually the state came along and paved all of 664. So I remember those days trying to get up here. But LF didn't mention a fellow by the name of Jim Wheat. Mr. Wheat, the head of Wheat First Securities, was just a giant. He was a marvelous guy. He, VMI graduate with all of that discipline. He was blind, and he would walk around here, and he could recognize people from their voice. And I remember, for example, bumping into him, saying hello. He would say, "Hey, Tony, have you ever seen such a beautiful day?" I mean, that was the concept that you had Jim Wheat, a blind person, who just was absorbing the environment and the beauty of these mountains. And that's really what was behind this. So a fellow by the name of Dick Nelms, unfortunately I saw he recently passed away about a week or two ago, helped organize. He was a major realtor in the Richmond area, and he organized a dissident group. And he came to our firm and asked if we would represent him. I told him that we would, but that I would not be part of trying to blow the deal up. The goal that we would do is to see if we could improve the deal. And then we go back to Mr. Wheat, who found out that my law firm and I, it was then Mays Valentine, which was a pretty prestigious law firm in Richmond, been there for years, were involved on the opposite side of Mr. Wheat. And I got a call, and he said, "I'd like to come see you. I'm coming over to see you." And I said, "Yes, sir." And I got a call from my receptionist that Mr. Wheat was there, and I said, "Well, I'll be right out to get him." She said, "No, I told him where your office is, and he's on the way." And I stood up, before I could even stand up from my desk, Jim Wheat is walking in to my office, and we had a chat and explained what our role hopefully would be. And a long story short, with some tax expertise, we determined that the $6,000 that was to be collected from each person would be, because of the way it was structured, considered ordinary income and not capital investment. And if we had to pay income tax on that $6,000 or $9 million, it would have just undermined the entire project. So we had a meeting at a law firm. LF was there, Ed Spears. I forgot if Mr. Wheat was there or not. And we discussed everything, and we came up, I think, at that meeting with a revision for the plan, and it got implemented. And it was on the go from there. So those contributions were secured from being taxable income. There was a solid investment in the community. But remember, the community, when it started, Doug Coleman was one of the first people involved. And the reason for that is no one liked him. He wasn't involved because they liked him. But the whole concept would be that this development wasn't going to be developed without attention to the environment. And I remember all the ads that were made at the time. They were environmental ads. They were a grandfather in a boat fishing on Lake Monaghan. Those were all guilt ads. The guilt was a basic motivator. So you had this high-powered Washington business person, lawyer, whatever, who realized that life isn't just 9 to 9 in the office, but it was taking advantage of the beauty of the mountains, the peace of the mountains, and understanding. So part of the deal was that you mentioned 13,000 acres. 2,000 acres was donated off to the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah, more like 3, but yeah.
And so the concept would be, all right, if you buy in this, or you're buying 11,000, 2,000 acres is forever preserved. Of the 11,000 acres, there's going to be 6,000 that is not going to be developed. And at the time of 5,500 homes, that was reduced to 3,800. So if you bought into this, what you were doing is buying into a smaller community with greater conservation preserves. And that would be hopefully an incentive. And it ended up working. We had, in essence, WPOA still, which if you consider it back then was a town, it still is. It has roads, police, rescue, fire. Then we had a major corporate citizen in the middle of the town, and that was Wintergreen Partners. We were the ones who ran the resorts, skiing, tennis, golf, all the amenities. And that was the responsibility of volunteers who had never been involved in this and trying to keep it underway. Dan had to pull his hair out, I'm sure, sometimes. Look at it. And consequently, we limped along, got along, and then succeeded. And you had the town, the corporate citizen, and then Wintergreen Development. And Wintergreen Development was a partner at the time. So for every new lot or new home that was sold, there was a substantial donation, or not donation, a substantial contribution to the partners, WPI. And that's the way it got balanced, and that's the way it went on until later on, obviously, when all the property was sold, then that's when we started looking to other areas, and I believe the next purchaser was the Justice Corporation, which purchased all of Wintergreen. But that's sort of where we got along. And then in 1980, we got the award. In 1987, we received that award, which, you know, when you look back at it, you realize what a prestigious award it was. You know, Wintergreen, small community, had ratings up here compared to any other resort that was down here, all keyed to preserving the environment. Then the next step, well, first of all, let me point a finger at LF. After I was the representative of the dissidents, the next thing I know, I missed a meeting, and LF called me up and said, oh, by the way, we had an annual meeting here, and you're now vice chair of the WPI board. Phil Barger, a great guy, business person from Waynesboro, was the first chairman. And then the next year, I missed another meeting, and I became chairman of the board until the 1990s. Then I flip in my chronology to 94, when we spun off the Wintergreen Nature Foundation. That was always part and parcel of the operating business, the WPI operating business. But the problem we had there was we invested X dollars, I think it was like $95,000 to $100,000 a year with no return. Very hard to get people to you know, invest and get a return on your money. So we spun off and helped create a 501c3 entity, which is what the Nature Foundation is today, and that started in 94. Unfortunately, I was busy in 94. I missed another meeting, and I became chairman of the Nature Foundation for about 4 or 5 years, I guess. I forgot exactly how long I had to work with some guy named Doug Coleman. So that's sort of the history of how it started with some dissidents, started with a dream, and it ended up keeping the dream going.
So let me, as I was sitting here thinking and looking at Mark Glickman, one of my favorite stories of Wintergreen was when we were in, you know, we were now being reasonably successful. We were selling property, but we really needed to expand the knowledge of the market that we were here. we were trying to build our brand, and one of the things that we were doing that people, were interested in was skiing. And so we thought, how can we get people in Washington, D.C. to really understand and think about Wintergreen as a place to ski? And Mark, who's extraordinary in terms of his ability to promote like anything, came up with this idea that, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to Washington, and we're going to get 19th Street from DuPont Circle to K Street closed. And we're going to make snow on that street, and we're going to have people skiing in Washington, D.C., and we're going to have the Today Show there and all that. And I'm thinking, this is crazy stuff. But knowing Mark and how successful he was, and Gunter then was in charge of the resort, we said, well, I don't know, maybe this will work. And sure enough, I mean, if you were watching the Today Show, you saw that 19th Street had been covered with snow one night. Skiers were all over the place, and we had, at that point, the weather being done all during the Today Show from that phenomenon that existed. And everybody knew. I mean, it was just a talk for a very long time about, oh my God, you're the group that was skiing in Washington, D.C. when there was no snow on the ground. And so, I mean, there were just countless things that happen or anecdotes, and we all have our favorites, I guess, of what kinds of things happen. But Wintergreen and its journey is just made up of a lot of examples of how things did happen that really proved to make a difference. And the aggregate of all that is sort of where we are now and what we've done. Mark would tell you too that was not, and by the way, we were front page, top of the full Washington Post for a day as a result of that, which is a hard thing to accomplish. But we continue to be in the Post because the weather got very cold. Mark would tell you we made a lot of snow. Nobody told us we were supposed to get rid of it. And that snow stayed there for like days, and traffic was a total mess in Washington because 19th Street, which was a major corridor. So we not only got in the news once, but a number of times as the people who can make snow even when it's not snowing.
So the other Mr. Glickman story that I enjoy is that we had all sorts of publicity on April 1st of one year that we were adding 2,000 feet elevation to the top of our mountain. And all sorts of news came out to look at trucks coming up, wondering how long it would take to add that additional 2,000 feet to the top. Well, they suddenly realized it was April 1st.
So with that, why don't we just turn this over. I don't know if any of my colleagues had anything they wanted to add, or if you had your favorite story, please feel free to do that.
LF, I'm wondering if Mark wants to defend himself.
Right. If not, then perhaps there are questions maybe from the audience, or there are things that we've said that we could explain further. Very much. In fact, he's going to be here, Doug.
We talked to Don last week, and he is as vociferous as ever and inspirational as ever, and we are working on a plan to get him here in May to speak. And he is in Vermont. And Don was the one who had the dream. And so I think that we'll have him here in May, and we'll let everybody know. And we'll work with Nancy and the Nature Foundation and make that happen.
So let me just say one more thing about that, because we didn't mention Don or Jim Wheat very much, but they were iconic in terms of Wintergreen. We kind of glossed over the visioning period. But Jim Wheat, blind though he was, very prominent, owned Wheat First Securities, sat as one of the board seats on the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, an incredible guy. And Don Faulkner, who is a real estate person who fell in love with this area and quietly put 13,000 acres of land together, were hugely important. We wouldn't all be here today except for them and their thinking and their early vision. And I think we all benefited from that, certainly. The biggest single piece of land was where we sit now, was called the Big Survey, and it was a 10,000 acre land grant that had never been subdivided. And it had been bought in the 50s by a person who was a professor at Duke University. His name is Bill Maddox, and Bill had bought the land in the 50s for $85,000, 10,000 acres for $85,000. But nobody else would pay that because it was waste land. I mean, you couldn't get here. What would you do with it? You know, so he owned 10,000 acres from the 50s all the way to, you know, the late 60s and 70s when he sold it and got about $1 million for it. And so, and Bill would come here from time to time because he was interested in what was going on. And so probably, I don't know, Peter, when we were selling land, Devil's Knob, but it was probably in 1975 or 6 or something. You, I think, sold a lot, a quarter acre for $85,000. And I called Bill and I said, Bill, you know that piece of 10,000 acres you bought for $85,000? We just sold a quarter of an acre of that land for $85,000. And Bill Maddox says, I'm coming up there to look at that. And he got in his car in Durham that moment and drove all the way here to have a look at that lot because he just couldn't believe, you know, the transformation and what had occurred, I guess, over that period of time. But was a bit of a realization, I guess, of that dream that was beginning to, you know, show itself at that time.
That 10,000 acres has been intact since 1796 and still is, basically.
And hopefully always will be.
I think it will be.
Right.
What got sea pines involved here, and how long did they last?
Well, you know, sea pines got involved because Cabot and Forbes, which was an iconic Boston-based company, had built its reputation on building high-rise office buildings, and they pioneered the concept of industrial parks, and they were very successful. They decided in the late 60s, though, they wanted to venture into recreational real estate. And recreational real estate for them became two places, here and a place, Sailfish Point, which was on the east coast of Florida, in sort of central east coast of Florida. And they had a model when they were doing their industrial parks and their high-rise office buildings that they had a project manager, in this case, Wintergreen, Gary Green, and they had an assistant, me, and the assistant was kind of the on-site guy, and the project manager was kind of the guy who was mostly in Boston but visited, and that's how you did a project. I guess little did they know that to do a project like this, I mean, you had to have, you know, people who could sell your land and product retail, so we had to have a sales organization. We had to have, we were going to be building ski slopes and restaurants and golf courses, and we had to have people who understood those and knew how to do that, and we had to, and on and on and on. So it became apparent that we kind of jumped into a business that we probably weren't well suited to be in, and we looked around and said, who really knows how to do this? And I must say, the year I graduated from business school at Darden at UVA, the company that hired more MBAs in the United States than any other was the Sea Pines Plantation Company in Hilton Head, South Carolina, which is hard to imagine today. And many of my colleagues or students that I'd been in school with actually had gone there, including Kyle Lynn, who came back to Wintergreen. So we said, well, let's go talk to those guys. And I knew a guy named Jim Chafin who was there, who was in charge of marketing, and he was a UVA grad and so forth. So we went there really to try to hire Jim Chafin to come here to help us trying to figure out this all. Jim, long story short, said, not in a position to do it, but why don't you hire the whole organization? And so there was a guy named Charles Frazier who was iconic in the business. He was one of the 40 under 40 people in Time magazine that was changing the world, and invented the condominium, if you can imagine. And so he made Sea Pines what it is, and he was the chairman. And so he got engaged and came here. And then we got Jerry Blakely, who was like in Boston, the iconic guy who had built Cabot Forbes. And those two guys kind of met at Wintergreen. And we used to have meetings, and they'd sit at either end of the table. And to me, it was like watching a ping pong match, and those going back and forth. But long story short, they got engaged not as an owner, but really on a contract basis to help us. And we then had this great Sea Pines, Cabot Forbes team that was going to carry us, you know, to the end. But then we had the big problem in terms of that I mentioned in both companies, not just Cabot Forbes, but Sea Pines likewise, had to go through a total reorganization. And that's when all of us said, hey, you know, some of us worked for Cabot Forbes and some worked for Sea Pines, and they all left us, and Bankers Trust came in, and so we then formed a company called Wintergreen Development Incorporated that became our company, made up of folks who were here, and we were all about building and developing Wintergreen. And so, you know, all of us then, you know, that was our company. And we did the contract with the Bankers Trust then for 8 years and developed there, and actually did other work for them. We developed a ski slope in the Catskills during that period of time, Windham Mountain, if any of you are familiar, next to Hunter Mountain up in that area. And we did other project work for them during that time. We were in their division of, you know, real estate that didn't work out. And we weren't that, but because we were weird in that we just showed up, you know, one day at Bankers Trust, that's where we, you know, got thrown into that group and really worked and helped them with a lot of the properties they had that needed help. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on about that.
But when you think of what LF is just saying, you know, Cabot Forbes, Sea Pines, and then suddenly we have Wintergreen being controlled by property owners who have never been involved in the ski business, the restaurant business, the golf business. And we didn't know what we were doing, in essence. So to be here today is providence, I assure you.
So what Tony's saying, I think, is really important, and that is that part of inventing this organization was that the governance and oversight of this, that we didn't know what that meant, and so lots of committees formed that became the tennis committee or the ski committee or the golf committee, and really were people who not only enjoyed that, but had a lot to say about how those things were going to function and how they were going to operate. And it was amazing that so many Wintergreen people were willing to spend so much time, volunteer time, working at and making this place work. And today, we're all beneficiaries of all the work that was done by lots of people, you know, that really have made a difference, many of them on a voluntary basis.
And thus the name of the book, Love of the Land.
Let me, I'm sorry, please.
Development at Stony Creek begun at about the same time as up on the mountain, or did that kick in later?
It kind of kicked in later. Stony Creek really, initially, we had our office there. We had the Rhodes Farm Inn, which was an old farmhouse on the property. We converted into an inn, and we built 10 places that people could stay. And so early on, when you came to Wintergreen, you came to the Rhodes Farm, you stayed there. There were barely roads up the mountain, and we were pre-selling. And the amazing thing about the people who are sitting here and the sales team at Wintergreen over time is how they were able to sell the dream. And we didn't have home sites finished, or we didn't have condominiums built, or we didn't have homes built, but their ability to sell people on the dream and get them to buy in early was critically important, because we were operating on a bit of a shoestring, and if we couldn't sell early, we didn't have the means to get to the finished product to be able to sell. And so for years, that's what, you know, happened here, and Stony Creek then was kind of the genesis of that. Ultimately, Stony Creek and that master plan that I watched being approved actually had Stony Creek being very much like the mountain in that there were going to be high-rise condominiums there and there was going to be much more density. All that changed when Tony talked about changing the master plan, and it became much more of a residential kind of rural place that kind of fit in with that community and Nellis Ford and all that, as opposed to much more dense, much more urban kind of feel. And in fact, the very first idea was that Stony Creek was going to be the step-off point, and the only way to get to the mountain was going to be a tram that went from Stony Creek to here. And everybody, all the renderings had little golf carts going around because there wasn't any road that got here. It was only by a tram. But Stony Creek then, has been, and I've lived there for more than 20 years, a wonderful part of Wintergreen, great success, but a very different environment. And, people would enjoy being able to play golf at Wintergreen in the morning and ski in the afternoon. There are not many places anywhere that you can do that, but because of the difference in elevation here, you can.
You talk about a shoestring. Why don't you explain Larry's selling of some paintings?
Yeah, I mean, part of what we went through, and it's I don't want to talk about it, but I mean, it was a real ethical thing for us because we were operating not knowing where the money was going to come from, but had lots of people very dependent on us in terms of our employees and our suppliers and others. And it was like, we fervently believed that this was going to work, and we knew if we ever stopped, it was dead. And so there were periods of time when on Wednesday you didn't have enough money to meet the payroll on Friday. And it was like, oh my God, what's going to happen when we tell our employees who are living paycheck to paycheck we don't have the money to pay. And so we had this Larry Rutherford who had come, and he was our finance guy. He had been my classmate at VMI, and he had finished the Darden School a year after me. Peter was a year ahead of me. We were all VMI guys, friends. But he came, and he was like an extraordinary finance guy. And so we would know that we needed to find $10,000 tomorrow in order to keep the place going for a week. And Larry would come in on Thursday and say, well, I just put the money in the bank. And I'd say, what do you mean you put the money in the bank? And it was always, you remember those expensive paintings that we bought for, to adorn the Mountain Inn? Well, I just sold them all, but we got the money and all that. Or my favorite was, we had a fire truck that was up here that was necessary that just kind of sat. Larry went out and got a lien and got $10,000 on the fire truck once in order for us to kind of keep things going. So, I mean, he was a master in challenging times, kind of keeping things going. But I mean, for all of us, because we knew we knew that this was important. It was a mission, as I said before, and one that we felt like we really couldn't let stop because it wasn't going to start again, or it was going to be very hard to start again. And there are lots of stories along the way about when we got right to that point where it should have stopped, but we got over that hurdle, and then we got to the next one, and so forth and so on. And it's like destiny. I mean, Wintergreen was supposed to be, and if you believed enough, it was going to happen, and that's the dream. And it's not just us, but it's all of you who have made investments here and made it all possible and made it all happen as well.
I think a lot of people thought failure was not an option.
Yeah, I mean, it never occurred to us that we could just let the place go. I mean, it was always about how do we get over, this bump, and how do we get over the next bump. And I mean, this Wintergreen Partners was about as big a bump as we had because we were right at the end, and Tony came along and kind of helped us put things together. And then there was a lot of stories beyond that because that was a new organization, and how that all functioned and worked were stories that Gunter could tell, and Peter and Tim and Gary, all these guys were very much a part of making that work as well. But it's a wonderful, rich story. It's generally captured in this book that you see here. If you don't have a copy of it, I mean, I keep pushing the book. I hope you will. The Nature Foundation gets all the proceeds of it. It's a good cause. And I understand we'll even be here signing books after this is over for anybody who might be interested or want one. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I've come to Wintergreen for 30 years, thanks to family that have been up here and have made beautiful memories. Family members have gotten married here. My little boy was taught by his grandparents to ski here. It's been a magnificent place. I'm curious about a couple of things. You mentioned how the taxes have benefited Nelson County. Are there other legacy programs that you're particularly proud of? Were there diversity supplier programs? Were there goals about employing local citizens that are maybe in place today that you're proud of? Another question I'm curious about is being stewards of the land here at Wintergreen. Was there ever part of the program to be stewards of the land in terms of garbage from Wintergreen? I'm not sure how many tons of garbage leave Wintergreen. What are the goals for recyclables coming from Wintergreen? Wondering if there's some legacy programs that you're particularly proud of that you put in place as you were stitching things together and keeping it going.
So, well, first, thank you, and thanks for that testimonial, because, I mean, as I started this by saying we really wanted to create something where families like yours could come and share and benefit, and it sounds like that's exactly what's happened in your case. I run into so many people around, and particularly people in Washington who tell me stories about, oh, I just found this great place in Virginia in the mountains, and I'll say, oh, where is it? Oh, it's Wintergreen, and they go on and on about how wonderful it is and how they found it and their families enjoying it and so forth. So thank you for that. A couple of things I would say. I don't know that I can address everything you raised. I think probably the thing that was really important and we're very proud of is that, and this has to do with local employment. And when we started this, there was a lot of concern from people in this area who had lived here for many years. As you can imagine, as you drive up what was Pine Hollow Road, 664, I mean, the thought of having all these people coming through their community and coming up back and forth was not necessarily a good thing. And on the downside, one, as we were getting permission to widen the road, I personally was hanged in effigy near here as part of the protest, and our office building was burned to the ground. So, I mean, this was not like everybody said, oh, kumbaya, let's all get, and I think it was a recognition of the fact that we were, you know, representing extraordinary change in an area that was really not at all prepared to understand or accept that and what was going on. And so we said, you know, there's no way we succeed here unless we get everybody to buy in. And part of everybody buying in was we're going to get local people to come to work for us because that's going to be important, and that has been important. I mean, we've gotten so many people in this county who come here and come to work, and now we have the kids of their kids and some of the grandkids and all that. So I would say a legacy program from early on has been that our preference is to hire somebody from right here, and it also adds to the experience if you've got local people who can help others who come here understand the area. So I think we are particularly proud of that fact, and that's maybe anecdotal, but there's so much evidence that that's made such a difference here, in addition to the economics and paying the taxes and so forth. Number one. Number two, I'm going to let Doug talk. I mean, he's been engaged in from the point of view of legacy things that we have done over time that have been you know, maybe somewhat ahead of our time in terms of environmental kinds of things. I would say that when we came here with this big project and this dream, we essentially had no oversight, no environmental requirements. We didn't have to do an environmental impact statement. There was no inspector in Nelson County. And basically, we got approved, and we could have done most anything, and we could have done very bad things. But we worked really hard, and we got the soil conservation people of Virginia up here early on to talk about how we could, you know, preserve and maintain and not do bad things in terms of runoff and affect the streams. Trout Unlimited were concerned about us early on and what we were going to do to the trout streams, and we invited them to come and set up monitoring stations, which they did, and we worked with them for years so that we could tell, you know, streams if we were doing things that were affecting them so that we could change those habits and so forth. And I think, you know, just made every effort we could, in spite of the fact we weren't, you know, required to do that, but we believed it was the right thing to do, and so we did countless things to make that happen. I don't know if that constitutes a program, but then I think Doug has come and educated us all from way back when he first came as the guy who, you know, from the apple orchards of Albemarle County, who was teaching locally, and has transformed, I think, and helped us greatly at Wintergreen even today. So, Doug?
Some of those things, LF, I didn't have anything to do with, but I think George Nicholas would tell you, he couldn't be here today, but I think he'll tell you that Wintergreen's sewage treatment system and the pump systems associated with that had never been done before. The pumping station that brought the water to the top of the mountain was unique. And one of these things, I mean, you have to remember that when it started, the Clean Water Act hadn't even happened yet. And so all of the environmental things that happened at Wintergreen, and I wasn't responsible for this, I was a cheerleader and an educator and a researcher in those days, but I mean, it was governed by man's conscience. And that makes it incredibly unique, because here were a group of developers that didn't have any restrictions and no inspections, and they were trying to get it right. That caught up with us a little bit when we did the tubing part, because to my knowledge, there had never been a stormwater management plan, and one wasn't required. And I think that Wintergreen did, as a result of some problems with that, I think Wintergreen put together, and Jay, you may remember too, I think Wintergreen put together the first stormwater management plan, because nobody in this particular area was developing a mountaintop community. They didn't know what to do with stormwater, because you can't stop water when it flows off a mountain. And so Jim Taggart and Brent Douglas and Jay may have been involved. We certainly, you and I were both involved in the in the slides on the tubing part. And as a result of that, Wintergreen did the first stormwater management plan for a mountain community. So I think that's right. But
we also, Wintergreen, when it first formed, the wastewater treatment system was owned by Wintergreen. And we were starting to have some problems there, and negotiated a sale to the wastewater authority. And to show what they offered us for the purchase was significantly more than it was valued at, in our opinion. So we rejected the higher offer and took a lower negotiated amount so that we could be fair with the wastewater, allowed that to freeze rates for the localities, or for the property owners here. And a lot of the proceeds of that are what you see across here, where the edge and all the ski is. That's purchased by the sale of our wastewater facility. We could have gotten a lot more and built more, but we did not, because we didn't want to take advantage of the county.
I'm not sure that's totally responsive to your question, but the other thing I would...
Not the second part, which is I really appreciate how Wintergreen has been responsible to the 13,000 acres of Wintergreen. My question would be, in terms of responsible tourism, responsible travel, the garbage, for instance, that leaves Wintergreen to go somewhere else. I'm wondering if there are, you know, environmentally responsible programs that were ever begun or will begin, or with the tons of trash that leave Wintergreen to go to some other land.
So,
Which I know this, the focus of this program
Right.
is the early days, and I was just wondering if there was a legacy program that, but you're answering how, in fact, Wintergreen has addressed some issues that you never had to address. So you are answering my question.
so let me also just point out this whole environment in which we operated. So one of the big concerns was there is no regulation. There also was no zoning. So we were beginning to spend a lot of money in an area, and knowing that 10 years from now, somebody could come in and say, gee, we need a zoning ordinance and you're no longer legal. And so it was a huge risk. So we actually wrote a zoning ordinance for Nelson County. It had one provision that we dealt with, and it was any plan unit development in excess of 10,000 acres. And it went on to describe kind of Wintergreen, and that was the beginning of the zoning in Nelson County. We subsequently helped them as they wrote their zoning ordinance. We helped them as they hired their first county administrator, their first building inspector, and on and on and on. And you know, it was, I think we were, you know, a very positive kind of behind the scenes influence in trying to help the county and protect what was here, because Nelson County was a beautiful county from the top of the Blue Ridge to the James River. It was a county that had no stoplights. I think it was unique in Virginia when we started, that nobody else could claim that. And today, it's a county that's beautiful from the top of the Blue Ridge to the James and has one stoplight. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's not only what we were doing here in our corner of the county, but the things that we've done to be helpful.
We had a horrible incident in the early 2000s, and that is we got our first stoplight in Nelson County.
Right. Which is in Livingston, not here, by the way.
You know, I think that the significance of part of what LF is talking about, and this is a tribute to him and the company, but they were doing environmental things when it wasn't cool. And if you want to look anywhere in the country at resort communities in 1971, 72, 73, I've looked at a lot of them. I've looked at the books that have been written on them. I don't think anybody can touch this place.
So one comment on that. Early on, as the master plan was being done, Don Faulkner had found a very prestigious firm in Baltimore called RTKL Associates, and they were terrific. And they had hired a fellow by the name of Ian McHarg. Ian McHarg had just written a book called Design with Nature, and it was the first time anybody had ever thought of anything like that. And he got involved on this master plan, and that's why there's so much open space, because it was carefully thought about and designed to only build on that land that was most suitable and to leave the remainder of it totally open. And so I think, you know, if you look at what we sold, as Tony alluded to earlier, to actually the Blue Ridge Parkway, because if you look at the original master plan, we had homes being built all the way to the top of Humpback Mountain. And Humpback Mountain is the most beautiful vista along the Appalachian Trail. And you can imagine the firestorm if we started building houses on Humpback Mountain. So we worked with them at a time when Ronald Reagan was president and said, we'll never buy any more private land. I mean, the government should sell what it's got, but they bought this because it was so important, and it was an important part of preserving then about 2,700 acres in addition to that. So that's done, and you'll always see Humpback Mountain as you stand outside this building, and it'll always look like it does now, which is a great thing. But in addition to that, of the remaining 10,000 acres, and Tim, you and I were talking about this the other day, but there's like 8,000 acres maybe that, if you consider all the open space, about 8,000 of it is considered to be green space or open space. And that's something I think we can all be proud of, and a contribution of 8,000 acres of forest and what it does in terms of carbon capture and so forth. I mean, it's an enormous positive thing that's going on that people are really beginning to understand and care about today.
I just want to make one comment about LF and Wintergreen development, and that, Wintergreen development dealt with people who were usually at high net worth and having a second home. LF realized this. LF realized this, and I was honored to attend the Nelson County Community Development Foundation dinner, retirement dinner for the head of the Community Foundation, George Krieger. But LF and Michael Donovan founded a community development foundation that put money into housing in Nelson County, and at the time actually affected 10% of the people that live here, people that didn't have running water, no roofs, no insulation, and developed and built 40 homes within the community. So the outreach from Wintergreen changed the attitude of a lot of people. They quit hanging LF in effigy, quit burning him, stopped burning down the buildings, and there was a real positive halo from some of these actions.
So, John?
Question for you. So many of the values that we talked about today that Wintergreen was originally built upon have become trendy again, the ESG and investing, the sustainability, the environmental. You look at Larry Fink's, bombshell announcement Friday about what BlackRock was going to be looking for in environmental and sustainability and governance with their mutual funds going forward. And what I wonder is, could a motivated real estate developer, young hotshot MBA, attorneys these days in 2020 actually create another Wintergreen?
I mean, Wintergreen has been called the last of the dinosaurs because it's really hard when you have a project that's as big as this that starts from scratch. And if you want to sell 3,000 or 5,000 units, I mean, it takes you 20 years to do that. And nobody can predict what's going to happen well enough in the future that they feel really good about making investments today based on the fact that you really got to be selling property 20 years, 15 years from now in order to, in order to make it an economic success. So and when you say a Wintergreen, challenging, but I think there are smaller things that are done that maybe have 600 units or 800 units, that are being done. And there's some very good people in the development business. I mean, it's not only is it BlackRock, but every Fortune 500 company is now looking at sustainability and what can it do, because all these shareholder meetings now, the biggest issue being raised is, what are you doing for the, what are you doing for the environment? And, big companies, the Exxons and Shells and all those people are really all in trying to look at sustainability, which is essentially what we've been talking about and doing here for a very long time. So I think the world is changing, at least what I know about this country, the world seems to be changing. And it seems to be moving very much in that direction, which is very encouraging, I think. And I think real estate people are smart enough to know that if they are going to be appealing, they're going to have to do many of the kinds of things that we've done in order to, successfully sell their products.
George Nicholas couldn't be here today, but I'll tell you the way George answered that question when we were doing the book. George said, there might be another Wintergreen, but nobody would live long enough to do it.
Right.
is what he said.
Or nobody would pay for it, right?
Nobody would pay for it. Yeah.
Doug, can you speak to the covenant to protect the place? I know there was a change in ownership and maybe like a conservative idea, et cetera, but it couldn't go forward, and now the covenants protect Wintergreen no matter who owns it.
I can tell you a few things, and I've got Jay here with me who can help. And feel free to interrupt me. What LF alluded to was of the original 13,000 acres, there's about 8,000. Actually, if you count the Park Service, that would be 10,000, close to 10,000 acres. So way over half the original promise to protect half of Wintergreen, way over, has been accomplished. Now, there, obviously, the 2,000 acres that's now owned by the Park Service is the Park Service. That's never going to be touched. There is about 2,000 acres on Crawford's Knob between the conservation easement and the timber easement that the Nature Foundation controls on the face of Crawford's Knob. So that's another 2,000 there that's protected. And then, Jay, you can explain the covenants if you want for the remaining like 6,000 acres that WPOA controls and how those covenants protect us. The conservation easement on Crawford's Knob, you can't build a cell phone tower, you can't do jack up there. That is a wetland that's protected.
So in speaking to the overall covenants, I don't know if you all have the book or have looked at it online, can search the document. It breaks the community up into parts. The first section is general covenants and speaks to all property at Wintergreen. So everything, whether it's the Nature Foundation that has it or WPOA has it. And then it breaks up almost into sort of subdivisions, recognizing that Stony Creek, when it was built, is very different than the mountaintop community, but not completely different. Completely different in that there are similarities in terms of the expectation that the governance would fall to the company, which is WPOA, that folks would be required to build a certain way, the mailboxes would be a certain way, that there would be a sort of a synergy amongst everyone that lives here, that there was an expectation that we all do what we can to protect the look of the place. But each section's a little different. Rhodes Farm has different covenants than the Stony Creek section, is what we call the old and the new. But they were, and it's interesting that when you think back to when the place started, how difficult it must have been to sit down and sort of foreshadow what it might be, right? That would these still work 40 years from now? And the vast majority of them do, because I think they put a lot of energy and effort in their early days to think about what that vision would be and make it work going forward. But the book is the key, and WPOA, the rights, the responsibilities to uphold the covenants, all transferred to WPOA. As the development was built and subdivisions were built out, the original development company would transfer those rights, those responsibilities on, and there's really only one or two subdivisions, I think it's only one, that will transfer over, and it's a piece of property down in Stony Creek that's very underdeveloped at this point. But that's, that's our role as WPOA. Most of the municipal functions, the town governance piece, and in many ways the covenants are the Bible.
Jay, what can be developed on the common open space that's controlled by WPOA? Certainly not residential development.
Things that benefit virtually everyone here, things like fire stations, recreation centers, a community center, churches, other things like Nature Foundation. Those can potentially be built on WPOA open space, but again, it's a real small group or a small list of things that can be developed in those parcels. We own a big parcel below the firehouse that was way back in the mid-'70s, was designated as perhaps a community center parcel. Most people don't know it. You drive right by it and don't realize that it was identified a long, long time ago. But again, it was that idea that as this place gets built, we have to set aside these pieces and be thinking about what they might need to be in the future. Chestnut Springs became one of those, obviously the firehouse, COB at the gatehouse. But there are still sort of remaining parcels where 20 years from now, will there be other sort of WPOA amenities and other things for the growth of the community? Probably so.
But I remember when WPOA gave us the 13 acres and the overlook that we may subsequently give back to you all, but we had to get a supermajority vote to do that. And the whole concept, this was the overlook, the Founder's Vision overlook, and the surrounding 13 acres of that. And we got a supermajority vote, and we had to do a phone-a-thon to get that vote. And the whole thing scared me because it required a vote for us to get that. And I was torn. We were going to build a building there, which we later bought Chilliam House. But the whole idea, the concept frightened me because, you know, the concept that we could, even the Nature Foundation, could get a vote to do something like that. I wondered at the precedent we were setting. But I think the covenants that protect Wintergreen, I think you're safe. And I think that I feel certain that the most important environmental pieces here have been locked down tight. And well, if I hadn't told you this, but I'll spring it on you. I've been invited to VMI next year to talk about the history of Wintergreen, and I'm going to be calling on you to join me. But there's an event there, and because Wintergreen had a lot of VMI people in it, they're very interested in hearing the story, and I suspect that we'll be telling it there at a state conference.
Trust you'll get a haircut before you go.
I missed that. What?
I trust you will get a haircut before you go.
Yeah,
to
I'll get a
VMI.
haircut, and I won't wear my old hat.
Doug, can I just,
Yeah.
I guess, conclude this? I know we've run a little bit over, and I want to be respectful of all of your time, especially anybody who's looking forward to seeing the AFC NFL championship game coming up. But did want to, I guess, and I'll let Tony conclude as well, but say thank you. And I was very sincere about this when I started, saying I think this is a journey that all of us are on together, no matter when you happen to learn of Wintergreen. And Wintergreen so benefits from people who are willing to spend this amount of time and care enough to come and talk about it. And so I just wish wish you well and wish everybody well. And I sincerely think the best days of Wintergreen are yet to come. So thank you.
Let me just join in those remarks, and I know a lot of you here, but you know, the people that are here are really the plank owners, if you will. John Coy has been involved in every organization, and people here aren't dedicating, and just because you know, they're doing it for a purpose, and the purpose is the love of the land. And so just carry on that tradition. Some of us happen to be involved, and we're lucky enough to help. But for example, I helped develop some guidelines for WPOA. I would discourage anybody to cut down any trees on their property because the penalties are now pretty clear what that tree cutting will cost you. So we've developed and evolved over the years, but only with people like you. So thank each and every one of you for being here today.
So you're part of the legacy. And if you want to get a book signed, you can come over here.